All right. Good evening, everybody that's here. Well, let's just say it's possible that you're seeing me and I'm not seeing you because I'm hot spotting just outside of Houston, Texas right now. This last week's class has not yet been put into the archive because I've had limited bandwidth while I was away, but that should be taken care of by about Sunday night. And I'll send everybody an email with a link to the archive from last week and this week so that you can go back and review those if you want to. This is the next to the last class of the semester. We will have one more class next week in person as well as online there at Fayetteville. So that's when we will do the final exam review and go over what's going to be on the final and get that sent out to everybody. Tonight, I know that we had kind of wound up last time looking at Jeremiah. And so I want to pick up and look at a couple of other things with Jeremiah before we move on to Habakkuk and Ezekiel and Daniel tonight. And so we'll go back and just basically start with Jeremiah here, often described as the weeping prophet of Judah, because he was a man who was very, very torn in his responsibilities as a prophet. His responsibility was to try to turn his people back to God in the face of the fact that God was about to send them into 70 years of captivity and suffering in being separated from their homeland and being separated from the promised land. The generations that Jeremiah deals with are generations of people, basically three generations, that don't want to accept that they really have any personal responsibility for the condition of their nation. They consistently try to lay off responsibility on their ancestors. It's all that our ancestors did. They're looking backward perhaps to the days of Manasseh and the sacrificing of children to idolatry and so forth, and saying, well, we haven't done anything that bad, so this we really don't deserve what you're foretelling for us. Now, Jeremiah's service as a prophet spans the reigns of the last 5 kings of Judah, like we talked about last week, from Josiah through Jehoahaz and Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, right down to the time of Gedaliah, who was appointed to be the governor after the period of conquest, after the fall of Jerusalem. And the message that God had given Jeremiah, even in the days of Josiah, the righteous king, the good king, where Jeremiah and his message were welcome in the palace, the message was one of impending punishment. The message was one of captivity. And that was, without question, that must have been hard for Jeremiah to deliver, because he loved his nation. He loved his people. At the time that Jeremiah is prophesying, Judah is an even smaller nation than they had been. They are a tributary nation to the Assyrians and then to the Babylonians. The Egyptians are making mischief in between there. And so they're not a world-dominating nation by any stretch. But after Josiah dies, Jeremiah's experience as a prophet of God becomes immeasurably harder, because now, where his message and his presence were welcomed in Josiah's day, and Josiah was doing whatever he could to try to turn things around and to improve the spiritual condition of the nation, well, Jehoahaz and Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim, right on down through Zedekiah, they have no interest in repenting. They have no interest in trying to correct things. And once Josiah is taken out of the way by the Lord, Jeremiah is no longer welcome in the palace. Jeremiah is he is rejected by the leadership. In fact, at one point, he is imprisoned in the days of Zedekiah, the last king. He's imprisoned in a mud-filled cistern because the nobles, Zedekiah's advisors, objected to his message. They didn't like what he had to say. They preferred the messages of the false prophets like Shemaiah and Hananiah. But in Jeremiah chapter 38, verses 6 and 7, Jeremiah is imprisoned for speaking the truth. And the very anguished descriptions that Jeremiah gives us show us the vividness of the pain and the emotional upset that he endured. Now, as we talk about these prophets who were contemporaries to the Kings and Chronicles, and we look at Jeremiah, one of the first things to notice comes right out of chapter 1, and that's the commission that God gives to Jeremiah. And so you look at Jeremiah chapter 1, and in verse 10, verse 9, he says, "Behold, I've put my words in your mouth." Well, right there, in one sense, right there is the definition of a true prophet. God's words in the man's mouth. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, and what does Moses tell us by inspiration about true prophets? They speak what God gives them to speak, and if a man prophesies something and it does not occur, if it does not take place, well, he doesn't get 3 strikes and then he's out. This is a 1 strike and you're out of here kind of thing. So, behold, I put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up, to break down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build, and to plant. And notice he says over nations, plural, and kingdoms, plural, because we'll get over farther into Jeremiah and discover that he doesn't prophesy only to Judah. Now, at the time that Jeremiah lives, Judah is all that remains of the people of God. The 10 northern tribes of Israel, they've been in captivity for 100 years. They've been in Assyrian bondage for 100 years. They were deported 100 years before. And so they're not really even in the picture in a sense. But Jeremiah's prophecy is directed not just to Judah and the little tribe of Benjamin that was attached to them, and the random Levites and Simeonites and Ephraimites and so forth that had clustered around Jerusalem. His message also concerns all of the heathen nations around them, and not just the nations around them, the Philistines and the Moabites, and the Ammonites and Edom and so forth, but it also deals with Egypt and with the remnants of the Assyrian Empire that become the Babylonian Empire and the Babylonians. So kingdoms plural and nations plural. But notice the purpose, the responsibility that God lays on him: to pluck up, to break down, to destroy, to overthrow. Those are strong words. Those are very forceful, imagic words. They have a strong image to them. But then he winds up to build and to plant. And there is, in a sense, there is a ratio of correction and edification here that's mirrored by Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2. Paul tells Timothy there, reprove and rebuke and exhort. We might point out that there are 2 ways to do wrong. One is by choosing the wrong way, and the other is by failing to choose or failing to pursue the right way. But there's only one way to do right, and that is to choose the right way. Reprove and rebuke and exhort. Pluck up, break down, destroy, overthrow. There was a lot in Judah's national psyche that needed to be destroyed. There was a lot that needed to be rooted out. There was a lot that needed to be broken and overthrown. Their idolatry, their self-centeredness. Remember, in the days of Zedekiah, the last king, one of the complaints that is brought against Judah and against the nobles particularly is that they devour widows' houses. Jesus would talk about the Pharisees in his day devouring widows' houses over in Mark chapter 7, and the fact that they would make donations to the temple and call it korban, dedicated, rather than take care of their parents, for example. Well, in Zedekiah's day, the nobles were taking advantage of the common people and appropriating their land and leaving some of them hungry in the streets for their own profit. They were gaining wealth, gaining riches, gaining property at the expense of their own kinspeople. So there were attitudes, there were practices, there were false beliefs and doctrines that needed to be rooted out and destroyed. And here is why Judah is going into captivity, because they have been trying to play both ends against the middle, God and idols against each other. They've been trying to have the benefits of both, the best of both worlds, as it were, and God is having none of that. Think about what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, when he says, no man can serve two masters. Now, it's a familiar statement. He'll hate one, he'll love the other, he'll cling to one, he'll despise the other. And what's the summary of it? You can't serve God and worldliness or mammon. You can't serve God and your own belly at the same time, so to speak. Well, in fact, why is that not possible? For the simple reason that God refuses to play on those terms, you might say. God is not going to cooperate with us when we're half-hearted in our association with him. He wants us to tear our hearts and not just our garments. He wants us to be fully dedicated to him. And that's what's being pictured here in Jeremiah's commission. Root out, pluck up, break down, destroy, overthrow. You got to get all this out of the way in order to build and to plant. Break up your fallow ground, Hosea would say. Break up your fallow ground. Get this out of the way. Now, flip over to Jeremiah chapter 2, which again is still very near the beginning of Jeremiah's work. This is during the days of King Josiah. So Jeremiah, his message and his presence are welcomed. And in chapter 2, you have a description of Judah's apostasy. Here's the root of the problem that is leading them into captivity in Babylon. You look at verses 11 and 12 and 13, and what you see is that Judah, the people, had not just ignored God. They hadn't just ignored his instructions. They hadn't. We read that Judah is going to celebrate its Sabbath years while they're in captivity. Well, it's not just that they hadn't been keeping the Sabbath years. It's not just that they hadn't been keeping the Jubilee and things of that sort. They had not merely ignored the Lord's will and the warnings that he'd been sending them for hundreds of years, but like their ancestors, like the slave generation that came out of Egyptian bondage and came to Sinai, they had substituted gods of their own making, their own devising in place of God. Remember what the children of Israel had done at the foot of Mount Sinai while Moses was up on the mountain in the presence of God. They came to Aaron and said, make us gods. And Aaron gathered up the gold and presented them a golden calf. And then when Moses came down and confronted him about it, what excuse did he offer? Well, I just threw it into the fire and this calf came out. Right. Sure it did. But here, Jeremiah is pointing out it's the problem that his people are having is that they're not just being faithless toward God. They had actually engaged in faithfulness to idolatry in the same breath, you might say. Now, read in verses 11, 12, and 13. Has a nation changed its gods, even though they are no gods? In other words, you have me as your God, and you've substituted rocks and sticks that are not gods. You've substituted worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars, and they're not gods. You've substituted that for me. Has the nation ever changed its gods, even though they're not gods? My people have changed. They have exchanged their glory. Think about that. Their glory. God is their glory. He's the source of their glory. He's the essence of who and what they are as a people, as a nation. And they've cast that off, they've thrown that away, exchanged it for something that has no value, that does not profit. Notice the admonition in verse 12. Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. Think about this, that they have exchanged. This is not even Jack in the Beanstalk and Jack's mother being astonished that he would trade a cow for magic beans. This is Jack as if he had traded the cow for a handful of dirt that had no value. Verse 13, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, number one. Jeremiah would say in chapter 10 and verse 23, the way of man is not in, it's not located in, it does not originate in himself. Our way, we're not born with instincts like a dog that tell us to be faithful and loyal and to always turn around 3 times before we lie down. You know, that's what a dog teaches a boy, is to be faithful and to be loyal and to always turn around 3 times before you lie down. Well, God did not create us with those kinds of instincts that cause us to do the right thing for who and what we are. My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. The way of man is not in himself, chapter 10 and verse 23. It's not in man that walks to direct his own steps. God did not pre-program us. He set us up to choose. And that's where Judah, in the days of the kings, had just gone completely off the rails. They'd made wrong choice after wrong choice after wrong choice after wrong choice. And it started at the very top with the kings and the nobles and even the priests in some generations, leading them astray. That's evil number one, forsaking the Lord. But evil number two, and as if to add insult to injury, they had jilted their God, the true God, the only living God, in favor of idols. They've forsaken me. They've hewed out, they've cut out, carved out for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Now, if you've ever drunk water that has sat still in a container out in the hot sun, you know that's not very appealing. When you have your choice between cool, running, living water and that old stagnant, lukewarm, tepid, maybe if it's in a metal cistern, that kind of tin tasting stuff, which are you going to choose? We would choose the fresh, the cool, the running water that satisfies. That tepid stuff, no, we don't want that. But that's what these people have done. Flip over to chapter 2 and verse 32, and notice there a similar rhetorical conundrum, rhetorical question. Can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. My people have forgotten me days without number. Go on into chapter 4, and here is where Jeremiah gives us that very picturesque appeal. In verse 2 or verse 3, thus says the Lord to the men of Judah and Jerusalem, break up your fallow ground. Do not sow among the thorns. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord. Remove the foreskin of your hearts, O men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my wrath go forth like fire and burn with none to quench it because of the evil of your deeds. So Jeremiah is pointing out to them in the days of even of Josiah, and Josiah is trying to make things right. His successors are not going to make any effort in that direction. But Jeremiah is pointing out one of the main problems that they had was that they were idle when it came to righteousness. They just weren't making an effort. They weren't putting forth any energy to do what was right. Over in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 8, Peter connects idleness with unfruitfulness. When a tree is not putting forth any effort, it's not going to bear fruit. How many times have you gone out and planted tomato vines or something like that in the garden, and maybe they put on beautiful flowers, but they don't put on any fruit? All the effort, all the energy is going into the flowers or the leaves, but it's not producing fruit. When Jesus came to the fig tree that had leaves all over it, he cursed it for not bearing fruit. Now, admittedly, it was out of season. It had leaves out of season, but the leaves indicated that there should be fruit, because the fig tree puts on its fruit before it puts on its leaves. And so the presence of leaves implied there ought to be lots of fruit here. And there was none, and Jesus cursed it, and it withered away to the root by the next day, and the apostles were astonished. Well, these people were a little bit like that fig tree. They were going through the motions, making it look like there ought to be fruit, but there wasn't. And because of that, they're going into captivity. Now, flip over to chapter 4 and notice the lamentation that Jeremiah gives us in verses 19 through 22. Now, this is describing Jeremiah's own feelings, Jeremiah's own emotions here. My anguish, I writhe in pain. Oh, the walls of my heart. My heart is beating wildly. I cannot keep silent, for I hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Crash follows hard on crash. The whole land is laid waste. Suddenly my tents are laid waste, my curtains in a moment. How long must I see the standard and hear the sound of the trumpet? For my people are foolish. They know me not. They are stupid children. They have no understanding. They are wise in doing evil, but how to do good, they know not. So this is Jeremiah's expression of his own suffering, but it's also a reflection of what God is feeling. They're wise to do evil, but they have no knowledge. They don't understand how to do good. They're ignorant. Now, you flip over to chapter 6, and in verse 16, you have really what could be a summary of all of Jeremiah's experience as a prophet of God. God sends him to tear down and destroy and to pluck up and to root out and to build and to plant. And Jeremiah goes about trying to do that. Well, in verse 14, he talks about the impact of the priests and the false prophets in not being wholehearted to God. They have healed the wound of my people slightly or lightly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. Were they ashamed when they committed abomination? No, not at all ashamed. They did not even know how to blush. Therefore, they'll fall among the thorns, among those who fall. At the time I punish them, they shall be overthrown. But now look at verse 16, and here, really, in a sense, here's the summary of all of Jeremiah's prophetic experience. He cries out, stand in the way, go out, stand at the crossroads in the road, and look north, south, east, west, stand in the way and see, look, ask for the old paths in which are the good way, and walk in that good way. That's all that Jeremiah is doing. He's appealing to these people, choose the right way. And what's the result? We will not. We will not. It's our choice. We choose to not walk in it. They refused. And so because of that, now they're going to go into captivity for judgment. Now flip over to chapter 7 and notice at verse 16, God says to Jeremiah, don't you pray for this people. Do not pray for this people. Do not lift up a cry or a prayer for them. Do not intercede with me, for I will not hear you. I choose not to hear your prayer on their behalf. Jeremiah's instinct is to pray for his people. That tells us that he is, at this point, he's interceding. He's wanting to beg God on their behalf, and God says, no, I'm not going to turn my judgment aside. Think about how harsh that sounds. Don't pray for this people. But we need to understand the background. You back up in chapter 7, and what do you find? Early on in chapter 7, God has appealed to them. Verse 3, the appeal is, amend your ways, change your deeds, and I'll let you dwell in this land. But they won't do it. You look down at verse 5, if you truly amend your ways, if you truly correct things, if you truly execute justice one with another, don't oppress the sojourner, don't oppress the fatherless or the widow, don't shed innocent blood, don't go after other gods, I'll let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your fathers forever. But they refused. And so God speaks directly to Jeremiah about his own personal conduct. Don't pray for these people. The time for intercessory prayer is long past. You know, there's a time for the child of God to pray and intercede on one another's behalf, and then there's a time when that intercession is too little, too late. And that's where we are now. The consequences are not going to be turned aside. You think about the youngster that falls in with the wrong crowd and conceives a child or is involved in some criminal activity and is caught, and now that child has to live with the consequence of that sin, raise a child, or be adjudicated in a court of law for some misdeed. And at that point, it's too late for mama and daddy to pray, oh Lord, take this away from us, because the circumstances are already in motion. And that's what God is telling Jeremiah here. The circumstances are already in motion. It's too late for intercessory prayer now. This is what the nation at this point needs, is repentance and obedience and faithfulness. And you see that down in chapter 7, verses 21 through 28. We can't substitute a little momentary religiosity for genuine repentance and reformation of our character. And that's what Judah has to learn in the days of Jehoahaz and Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah. Now, Josiah recognized this when the book of the law was read to him, when Hilkiah found the book of the law and Shaphan brought it and read it to the king, and then the king commanded it to be read to everybody. He's in a tizzy almost, because he recognizes the implications of the law. We're on the wrong track. We're headed the wrong way. God is going to execute justice on us, and we deserve it. Now, Josiah is spared having to see that because of his righteousness, because of his efforts to turn his people back to God. But that does not turn God's judgment away from them. Even as they try to make folks feel good about their sinful condition instead of telling them what they really need to do. You look at chapter 8, you have really a picture in chapter 8 of a lot of the religious leaders of our day. You pick up in verses 9, 10, 11, and 12, and notice here he says, the wise men shall be put to shame. They shall be dismayed and taken. Behold, they've rejected the word of the Lord. So what wisdom is in them? Therefore, I'll give their wives to others and their fields to conquerors, because from the least to the greatest, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. And here's this statement again: they've healed the hurt or the wound of my people lightly, saying peace, peace, when there's no peace. Were they ashamed when they committed abomination? Not at all ashamed. They do not know how to blush. That sounds just like chapter 6, doesn't it? Therefore, they shall fall among the fallen. When I punish them, they shall be overthrown. So, come over into chapter 9, and you have what may be the most succinct definition of true wisdom in all of the Bible. Look at chapter 9 and at verse 23. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord. Now, in the context of Jeremiah and his work, he's about to encounter false prophets who are very popular, very welcome. They're going to have the ear of the succeeding kings after Josiah, where Jeremiah is not, and is going to be rejected and pushed out and unwelcomed, accused of treachery and traitorous behavior and so forth. But here, he contrasts the wisdom, the might, the riches of this world with God's consistent love and justice and righteousness. The Apostle Paul echoes that same thought in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting at verse 20, and again in chapter 3 from verses 18 to 23. That is, that human wisdom just does not compare to heavenly wisdom. Now, we mentioned Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23 a minute ago. It's one of the most familiar passages in Jeremiah. I know that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his own steps. And think about what Solomon had written hundreds of years before in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12. There's a way that seems right unto a man, but its end, its destination is the way of death. Our lives in this world are not pre-programmed. Here's one of the faults of Calvinistic theology, and Calvinism really has its roots in Catholicism, 4th century Augustine. But here's the fault of Calvinism, because Calvin basically says your life is pre-programmed. Calvin's thinking actually is a lot like Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar in the days of Job. Remember, when Job suffers his great catastrophes and reverses, his friends come and they sit silently with him for a week, and that was the best part of them being there, was they didn't say anything that first week. As soon as they opened their mouths, things went downhill fast, because they started blaming Job for what had happened to him. And their contention is, God did this to you. Well, the Calvinist basically says that you're pre-programmed. If you're going to be saved, you're saved no matter what, and you couldn't get lost if you tried. And if you're lost no matter what, and you can't be saved even if you want to. But we're not pre-programmed by instinct or by destiny. God did not draw your name out of a hat before creation and decide, okay, Michael Holland is going to be saved, and Michael Richardson, tough luck, Michael Richardson, you're going to be lost. Can't help it. Nothing you can do about it. That's not how God deals with folks. Our fate is not fixed. By the same token, God did not send us into this world equipped to navigate all the way through life entirely by ourselves without any help from Him. He created us with the need and the ability to accept His guidance and His help. And here's where the leaders, the kings and the priests and the false prophets in Israel, in Judah, here's where they were falling short, was they refused His help. They're like the guy in the story about the man sitting on top of a house in the middle of a flood. And guys come by in a boat and say, come on, we'll help you, we'll rescue you. No, I'm going to rely on God. And they go on, and a guy comes by in a motorboat. Come on, let me save you. No, I'm going to rely on God. And the guy lets down a rope from a helicopter. Grab hold of the rope. No, I'm going to rely on God. And the waters rise, and the guy drowns. And when he faces God in judgment, why didn't you save me, Lord? What do you mean? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. Well, these people are trying to do everything on their own. And that's not how God created us to function. Whether we accept His blessings or reject them is up to us. Now go over to Proverbs chapter 4 And in verse 23, what does Solomon say? Guard or protect, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. God did not fill your heart with all the knowledge that you need to navigate safely into eternity apart from him. In Jeremiah chapter 17, in verse 10, our prophet, our man of God here, gives us the reminder that God searches us. He tests us. Look at verses 7 and 8. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He's like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. In other words, that tree has sense enough to reach out to the source of life, the water. But get down here to verse 10. He says in verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind and give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. So God provides, but we have to rely on him. Our thoughts and our motives have to pass muster with him. And that's precisely the point that the Hebrews writer makes in Hebrews 4 in verse 12 concerning the action of God's word within us. The word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It discerns, it discriminates the thoughts and intents of the heart. It exposes us for who and what we are. So, Jeremiah provides all of this counsel, this wisdom to the kings. In Josiah's day, it's very welcome. Remember, Jeremiah begins his prophetic work before the Babylonians come on the scene. And Josiah is correcting things basically as fast as he can go, but he's only got a limited amount of time. He's going to have 31 years, and Jeremiah appears about halfway through those 31 years. Now, one of the most valuable lessons that we see in Jeremiah as it relates to his circumstance in dealing with the kings of Judah is in his own experience, his own faithfulness. You flip over to Jeremiah chapter 20, and you see there that he was not immune to depression, to discouragement, to disappointment. You look at Jeremiah chapter 20 and verses 7 through 9. Lord, you deceived me and I was deceived. You fooled me, Lord. You're stronger than I. You've prevailed. And the result is I'm a laughing stock all the day. Everybody mocks me. You gave me a message to preach, and here's the response that I get. I cry out violence and destruction. I'm trying to warn the people. And what do? The word has become a reproach for me, a derision all day long. They make fun of me. And so I've come to the point where I say, I'm just not going to speak anymore. I'm just going to hush. I will make no mention of him. I will not speak anymore in his name. And then your word burns me up from the inside. Your word is like a fire contained in my bones, burning me from the inside out. And I'm worn out. I'm weary. I'm exhausted with trying to hold it in, and I cannot contain it. It becomes so urgent that he just can't keep silent about God and about what's coming, about trying to warn the people. Now, keep in mind that the overall picture of Jeremiah's work is you can't turn this aside. Judgment is coming, and you can't defer it. You can't delay it. You can't avoid it. So you need to, when Nebuchadnezzar comes knocking, you need to open the gates and lay down your weapons and surrender peacefully and go willingly and peacefully into captivity, because this is of God. And of course, they don't want to hear that. And so because they don't want to hear that, Jeremiah is set up for this internal struggle that's going to shape and cause him to become the man that he is, of having to choose between God and being accepted, having to endure hardship and endure hard things and endure hard emotions in order to be faithful to God. Now, I think I mentioned this last week, but flip over to chapter 22, and particularly verses 24 through 30, where Jeremiah is told to declare that Coniah the king, and that's Jehoiachin, according to 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 8 through 16. He's also called Jeconiah over in Esther chapter 2, verse 6. Write this man childless, verse 30. We talked about this last week, I believe. And that expression does not mean that he would have no children. This is not the end of the lineage of David. His children are mentioned in verse 28. You look at verse 28, his children will go into a land that they do not know. And that word childless means desolate or destitute. It does not mean he has no children. The Greek translation, the Septuagint, which was produced over 100 years before the birth of Jesus, describes Coniah here as cut off or as banished. And the point is not the royal lineage dies here. The point is no seed of his, no descendant of his will prosper sitting on David's throne and ruling in Judah. That means that the millennial folks who are still trying to put Jesus on David's throne in Jerusalem, they're dead wrong. They have to make a liar out of Jeremiah to get their doctrine. And Jeremiah says that's not going to work. Well, look over to chapter 23, and at verse 24, you have a very sobering thought. The Lord asks, is there any secret place where someone can hide and God not see him? Well, we already know the answer to that. David had already spoken to that in the Psalms. You know, where shall I go to get away from God's presence? Psalm 139. If I go into the highest mountain, you're there. If I go into the depths of the sea, you're there. If I go into the grave, go into Sheol, you're there. There's no place to get away from God. Well, here in Jeremiah chapter 23, at verse 24, you have the same basic thought. Can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? Now that takes on added significance when you think about who those words are addressed to through Jeremiah. We've come from Josiah's righteous period into the days of Jehoahaz and Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah. And these guys are focused on trying to hide the fact that they're trying to play God on the one hand against idols on the other. And Jeremiah's words basically say, who do you think you're fooling? God is not going to be mocked. What did Paul say in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7? Whatever man sows, that's what he's going to harvest. Whatever he plants, he'll harvest. Don't kid yourselves. Well, in chapter 25, again in chapter 27, God describes Nebuchadnezzar. Now Jeremiah is making public reference to the Babylonian emperor, Nebuchadnezzar. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar's army has come to Jerusalem. This is probably the time frame in which Daniel and his companions are being taken into captivity to become Babylonian bureaucrats and statesmen. This may even be down to the time of Ezekiel going into captivity, 597 BC, when the middle class is being vacuumed up and all the tradesmen are being relocated against their will, but basically freely into the Kibar River Valley or the Kibar Canal area outside of Babylon. But here, God describes Nebuchadnezzar, an idolatrous heathen king, as my servant. This is my servant. And the thing that the rulers of Jeremiah's day just cannot refuse to wrap their heads around, just cannot grasp, is how that God can use somebody who does not acknowledge him, who does not worship him, who is not one of them. And here's really the root of it. they couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that God could use somebody, that God could manipulate somebody who was not one of them to do good things, to carry out his will. Now, what God is going to use Nebuchadnezzar to do is a great thing for Judah, but it's not a fun thing by any stretch. It's a good thing in the sense of getting them away from idolatry, getting their minds right once again, you might say, correcting them. But there's nothing fun, nothing joyful about it until they come to the point that they can appreciate the value and the benefit in repentance. Now, the fact that he describes Nebuchadnezzar as my servant simply emphasizes the truth of what Daniel says over and over again in Daniel 4:17 and 25 and 32. That is, God rules in human kingdoms. God is ultimately in charge. Now, let's think about that in the 21st century. Vladimir Putin has started a war with Ukraine, a war of aggression, and is apparently just brutalizing that nation and his army indiscriminately torturing and murdering civilians and so forth. How is it that man, Putin, can still be in power in Russia? God rules in the kingdoms of men. What about Xi Jinping in communist China, diligently building a cult of personality and outlawing religions that conflict with Chinese communism? Or Narendra Modi in India, the standard bearer of the BJP party that wants to turn India back to aggressive Hinduism and has outlawed conversion from Hinduism and so forth. What about the rulers in some of the more aggressive Muslim nations who promulgate laws that actually make converting from Islam to anything, much less Christianity, a crime punishable by death? How do we wrap our heads around this? God rules in the kingdoms of men, gives them to whomsoever he will. Well, why would God do this? Does he not present us a dramatic challenge by doing this? A challenge to demonstrate in our lives, in our congregational existence, in our presence in the communities, in our presence in the nation. Is this not a dramatic challenge to rise up and demonstrate the legitimacy, the authenticity, the genuineness of the gospel, of Christianity, of God's way of doing things? Is this not a direct challenge to us, in a sense, to demonstrate the superiority of God's way over all these false ways? The question is not, why does God allow all this other stuff to go on? The question is, why do we not stand up and present a much more vivid, vocal, open presence and representation of God's presence in this world? It's said that in the first generations of the church, the blood of the martyrs acted as the seed of the kingdom. The question perhaps for us is, how many of us would be willing to fertilize the ground at that cost for the sake of the kingdom? Well, go on in chapter 26 in Jeremiah, and you notice there in verse 2, the Lord himself sets the standard for faithfulness in preaching and teaching his words. Notice what he says to Jeremiah. Now, this is addressed to Jeremiah directly. Stand in the court of the Lord's house. Speak to all the cities of Judah that come to worship in the house of the Lord all the words that I command you to speak to them. Do not hold back a word. That echoes what Solomon had written in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 6. You speak for God, and you speak what God gives you to say. You don't say only what's comfortable, only what's convenient. 500 plus years later, the Apostle Paul would tell the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20, verse 27, I have not shunned, or I have not withheld myself from declaring unto you the whole counsel of God. There's nothing I've held back. Seek with your whole heart. Don't be a Sunday only Christian in that sense. Now, you look at Jeremiah 31, and verses 31 to 34 are commonly recognized not just by Christians, but in Christendom generally, as a prophecy of the coming kingdom, the kingdom of Christ. What it's important for us to understand, however, is that the Hebrews writer over in the New Testament applies these words, Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. He applies these words to the church that already existed at the time that the Hebrews writer is writing. So when Jeremiah here talks about the days coming when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, he's not talking about somewhere off in the far distant millennial fever dream future. He's talking about the first century. He's talking about the establishment of the church. That new covenant, that's the covenant of Christ. That's not something off in the far distant future. That's what's been in place since Acts chapter 2. And the Hebrews writer applies those words to the church. Remember how Hebrews chapter 1 begins? God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in what? In these last days. He didn't say in the coming last days, somewhere off in the distant future when the last days finally get here. We're not waiting for the last days. We're in the last days and have been since Acts chapter 2. God has spoken unto us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the world. And so when the Hebrews writer then says, these words of Jeremiah apply to the church, our millennialist friends who take them and try to make them apply to yet coming events are taking them out of their proper context. So, as we look at Jeremiah, the rest of Jeremiah, beginning really in chapter 36, you have Jeremiah's judgments against the nation of Judah, but then also against the surrounding nations. Warnings. We go from Jehoiakim in chapter 36, where God has dictated to Jeremiah all of the prophecies, and Baruch, Jeremiah's secretary, has written them down as Jeremiah has dictated them. And then that has been taken and read by some of the elders of Israel, and they bring it to Jehoiakim in the palace and have it read to him. They read a few lines, and Jehoiakim takes his knife and slices them off and tosses them in the fire. They read a few more lines, he slices that off, tosses it in the fire. In other words, if I just burn up God's word, then I don't have to worry about these prophecies. I've destroyed these prophecies. There's no more issue here. Well, what does God have Jeremiah do? Go get you a new scroll, and you have Baruch write down everything you dictated all over again, and I'm going to add a whole bunch more to it on top of that. And that does not bode well for Jehoiakim. Get over to chapter 38 and chapter 37 and 38, and God is warning Zedekiah. We've jumped forward about 10 years in time between chapter 36 and chapter 37. Now, God is warning Zedekiah about his misbehavior. But before we get to that, look back to Jeremiah chapter 35 for just a minute, because we are introduced in Jeremiah chapter 35 to the sons of a man named Rechab, or Rechab. Sounds a lot like Rahab the harlot, but this is an individual. And Rechab was the father of Jehonadab, who had participated with Jehu in slaughtering the worshipers of Baal after the death of Ahab back in 2 Kings chapter 10. And his claim to fame, this man's claim to fame, was the command, the decree that he had given to his children, to his descendants. Don't eat any fruit of the vine, any grape juice. Don't even eat grapes, and don't live in houses. You be sojourners, nomads always. Don't plant fields, don't plant vineyards, don't drink grape juice or wine in any form whatsoever. You look at chapter 35, verses 6 and 7, and God instructs Jeremiah, you bring them in and set all of this before them and command them to eat and see what they do. And verse 6, they answered, we will drink no wine. Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, you shall not drink wine, neither you nor your sons forever, nor build a house, nor sow seed, nor plant or have a vineyard. You shall live in tents all your days, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. We have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, son of Rechab, our father, in all that he commanded us. Now, the point that Jeremiah makes, this is a parable, an illustrated parable for Judah. These people have been more faithful to this voluntary commandment imposed by their ancestor than Judah has been to God. They refused to drink. They refused to do these things because they were being loyal to their ancestor. Jeremiah, God through Jeremiah, is making the point that his people, Judah, had not obeyed the commandments of their God anywhere near as faithfully as these Rechabites. They were consistent public examples of faithfulness and obedience in Israel. And because of that, God promised, verse 19, that they would never lack for a man to stand before him. So we talked about Jehoiakim in chapter 36, and then Zedekiah being warned again and again in chapters 37 and 38. That's where Jeremiah winds up in the cistern in chapter 38. He's thrown in there to get rid of him. But that brings us to chapter 39 and the fall of Jerusalem. So at the fall of Jerusalem now, we could look through the balance of the rest of Jeremiah, but I want to take our attention over to the book of Lamentations, which really is Jeremiah's chronicle, or his dirge, his funeral lamentation over the death of the city and the nation. We talked a little bit last week about how that Lamentations is laid out as a mnemonic aid. 5 chapters, chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5, each have 22 verses. Each verse begins with a word that corresponds to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, 22 verses in each of these 5 chapters. And the first verse begins with Aleph. The second verse begins with a word that begins with Beth and Gimel and Daled and so on, all the way through the Hebrew alphabet, so that if you could say your ABCs, basically, you could memorize the book of Lamentations. Now, chapter 3 is a little different because it's not one verse per letter. It's triplets of verses, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way through 66 verses arranged the same way. This way, the people can remember and recite the picture that Jeremiah saw in the destruction of Jerusalem, and they can learn and remember. Think about this, that most of the people of Judah, a huge portion of them, were not there to see the fall of Jerusalem. You have thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands who are already living exiled in Babylon at this point. From Daniel's day in 606, when he and his companions were taken hostage, basically, to try to ensure Jehoiakim's good behavior, down to the days of Zedekiah in 597, when Ezekiel and the middle class and the priestly caste and so forth were largely deported. Most of the Jews no longer live in Judah. And so they're not eyewitnesses to the devastation, the destruction, the brutality, the horrible violence and cruelty of the Babylonians in actually demolishing Jerusalem and the temple and the palace. those who are there see all these things up close and personal. And Jeremiah presents the record of this as if he's sitting outside the city on a hillside watching this unfold. He's actually in the city. But this is a 5-verse or 5-stanza lamentation, a funeral dirge for the death of a city and a nation. And in chapter 1, what we see is the battered, empty shell of Jerusalem, like a woman who's been used and humiliated and exposed to the world, shamed in the sight of all people, out in broad daylight in public, because of her own willful sins, and she's been brought out to be humiliated in public. You look at verse 12, and Jeremiah's heart is breaking because of the shame and the suffering that's being put on display. How can anybody just pass by and not be moved by this? Is it nothing to you, all of you that pass by? But then you get to verse 18, and Jeremiah points out, as horrible as this is, they deserved every bit of it. There is no injustice in this. There should be no pity here for this, because they brought it on themselves through their rebelliousness against God. Now, in chapter 2, you have an image here that could almost be, this is what it's like when God is your enemy. This is what it's like to have God as your enemy. God executes his judgment against Jerusalem without pity. Remember the pity that God had shown to Josiah. God foretold in Josiah's day that things would happen to Jerusalem that would make your ears burn. But because of Josiah's goodness, he's going to turn that aside during Josiah's lifetime. Now, at age 39, in 609, basically, 609, 08, 07, along in that time frame, we have the Egyptians coming up to do battle with the Assyrians at the Battle of Carchemish. And Josiah goes out to meet Pharaoh Necho and basically be on the side of the Assyrians. And that's where God takes Josiah out of the picture. 31 years into his reign, 39 years old, he's killed in battle. And we think, but he was so good, why would God allow that? Because now it's time for judgment. The cup of God's wrath has reached the brim, and this is God's mercy in taking Josiah out of the way. But now, Lamentations chapter 2, with good, godly, righteous Josiah out of the way, here's what it's like when you're on God's wrong side, when God is your enemy. You look at verse 11 in chapter 2, just graphic imagery here. My eyes are spent. My eyes are worn out with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out to the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, because infants and babies faint in the streets of the city. Even the children are dying, suffering. Here's what it's like to have God as your enemy, to have so misbehaved that God is your enemy. And there's no pity in his judgment. There's no withholding of punishment. There's no dialing it back on his part. Now, go on into chapter 3 in Lamentations, and you've got here what you might call 22 miniature poems, 3 verses each, that in the middle of all this catastrophe and suffering and destruction, Jeremiah celebrates the goodness and the faithfulness of God. I'm the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He's driven and brought me into darkness without light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. Made my flesh, my skin to waste away, broken my bones, besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation, made me to dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. walled me about so that I cannot escape. He's made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayers, blocked my way with stones, has made my paths crooked. And he talks about how hard this is for him as an observer of the justice of God. He's an eyewitness to the death of a nation, to the agony of his people. And then what does he do? He talks about he's made my teeth to grind on gravel and so forth. But then he turns to God. Verse 19, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And now the focus changes at verse 22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. Even as he's just consumed with the agony of his nation, he can't help but look beyond that to the promise of restoration. Yes, they have to suffer. Yes, they've got to take a beating, as it were. Justice has to be answered. God is not going to just let it go. Justice will be served. But after justice is served comes restoration. And so even as you go into justice, and as hard and terrible as it is, and it's only terrible because they've brought that part of it on themselves, but as tough as it is, you have hope. When you go into captivity, even if you go as a slave in chains and you're sold, you have hope. Steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. And throughout the rest of the chapter, you see Jeremiah reminding the people. Now, at this point, Jerusalem is destroyed. At this point, they're devastated. At this point, the captives over in already in captivity with Ezekiel, they're bereft and saying, well, maybe our God doesn't actually even exist. Maybe the Babylonians are right. And Ezekiel, this is at chapter 25 in the book of Ezekiel. Now Ezekiel is changing his focus and saying, yes, God still exists. Yes, he still loves you. Keep faith with him and he will take care of you. But here in chapter 4 of Lamentations, now we go back to what Jeremiah is actually seeing. All the beautiful, precious things of Jerusalem, the temple, the altar, everything that's beautiful there is shattered and burned and demolished. The people are starving and in rags and filthy. They've lost everything that they prized. They've fallen so far in their idolatry and their disregard. Look at chapter 4 and verse 10 for a minute. They have fallen so far away from God that they even resort to cannibalism rather than repent. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They have become their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. Rather than repent, they've resorted to cannibalism. And so you look at the final stanza, chapter 5, the sadness here just surpasses description in a way. And so Jeremiah pleads, remember us, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Don't abandon us permanently, he says. Remember, once upon a time we were faithful. We can be again. Now he makes a very frank confession of their sins. Look down here to chapter 5 and verse 16. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. And then you get down to verses 21 and 22, the last two verses. Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. So you have this appeal on the part of Jeremiah. Even in this horribly sad situation, in this horrible circumstance, there is that appeal to remember us, remember who we were, who we can be again. Well, that brings us then to Habakkuk, who is a contemporary of Jeremiah, and of course a contemporary of these last kings in the days of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And Habakkuk, one of the so-called minor prophets, is a much shorter little book. And the purpose of Habakkuk is to demonstrate, to show God's justice. Remember that the one of the complaints, one of the objections that is just consistently raised, especially to Jeremiah and to Ezekiel, basically the people are saying, well, how can God be a fair God and punish us and not punish all these other people? Our neighbors, the idolatrous people around us, they're so much worse than we are. How can God be fair if he doesn't punish them ahead of us? And of course, his prophets are emphasizing what's going on out there has nothing to do with what you're doing here that's wrong. Their sin doesn't make yours any less sinful. Now, you have 5 parts to this little 3-chapter book. You have in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the first complaint that God lodges. This presents almost like a defense or a prosecuting attorney making his case. Now, God had used Assyria to punish Israel back in the 8th century, in the 700s, in the days of Isaiah. And now he's going to use Babylon to punish both Assyria and Judah. They'll punish Assyria by consuming them from the inside out, and then they'll punish Judah by conquering them and deporting them. And the people are just objecting vociferously. How can God do that to us? They're worse than we are. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with what you have coming. Habakkuk, these 3 chapters, just to read them, this is a beautiful book, beautiful writing, beautiful poetry in a sense. It's a poem that's unusual as a book of the Bible because it doesn't tell a story of events. It's the record of a conversation between Habakkuk and God. It's the record of Habakkuk trying to understand why God has allowed evil to continue among his own people for so long. That's chapters 1 and 2. And then in chapter 3, Habakkuk gives us a beautiful description of the majesty, the glory of God. And chapter 3 is an acrostic in Hebrew, much like Lamentations, and it reads very much like a psalm. Now, this 3 chapters of Habakkuk dates from about 606 BC, about the time that Daniel and his companions go into captivity. And it's not Habakkuk's prophecies or warnings to the people. It's, like I said, it's a conversation. It's Habakkuk trying to understand, how can you do this, Lord? He complains about what the people see as God being unfair to them, punishing Judah's sins, but not the Babylonians. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you, violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong?" So there's almost an accusation here on the part of the prophet. He doesn't like having to witness what's beginning to happen. He doesn't like seeing his people humiliated by the Babylonians and seeing the sons of the royal house like Daniel being taken away. Daniel's going to live 90 plus years as a foreign bureaucrat. He's going to go into captivity probably as a young teen, and maybe even before he gets there, but certainly after he gets there. Almost the first experience he's going to have almost certainly is to be castrated. And so he's going to be a eunuch all his life. He's going to live 90 plus years. He's going to live all the way through Babylonian captivity. He's already at least a young teenager. So by the time Babylonian captivity ends, he's in his 80s. By the time he's in the lion's den in Daniel chapter 6, he's already an old man. And when we get to the end of Daniel, the Babylonians aren't in charge anymore. Now the Medo-Persians are. And where's Daniel? Why, he's serving in the Medo-Persian government. So he's probably 90 plus years old at that point. He's lived all these generations in captivity, in exile. As far as we see, Daniel, after he is deported in his youth, never sees the promised land with his eyes again. Never lives there again. Habakkuk is looking at this at the time that Daniel, a young man, is first going into captivity. And he's seeing what appears from the Jews' point of view to be injustice. These people are so much worse than we are. We may worship idols, but we worship you too, God. And they don't even worship you. And the complaint is the people see God as unfair for punishing Judah, but not Babylon. And Habakkuk is protesting about having to see this and experience this. God's answer, God's reply is that I'm not overlooking anything. I'm not overlooking Babylon's injustices, Babylon's cruelties. I'm going to judge them as well. You look down to chapter 1 and verse 6, they're called Chaldeans there. But he says in verse 6, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. He talks about how tough they're going to be. He says, I'm the one raising them up. Like we talked about last week and several weeks ago, there's no logical, political, or economic reason for the Babylonian Empire to come into existence, for the Babylonians to be able to overthrow the Assyrians and supplant them. The only rational explanation is God did it. They did not have superior military might or tactical ability or economic power or a superior philosophy of life or anything. But God raised them up for their specific purpose, that bitter, hasty nation. The interesting thing about the Babylonians, like the Assyrians who they supplanted, were famous in their day for their brutality, for their cruelty, for devising ways of making people suffer who opposed them. And the Babylonians followed more or less in that vein. They deported people to other lands and filled their lands with people from other lands and so forth. And so we look at this, and the interesting thing about this bitter, hasty people, as Habakkuk describes them, they'll be the last empire to do that. The Medo-Persians aren't going to follow that practice. They're going to be, in many ways, much more humane. Alexander and his Greeks are not a whole lot more humane in that respect. They can be quite brutal, but they're not going to deport people wholesale like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And the Romans likewise are going to be much more like the Medo-Persians, in that they go in and they conquer and they just leave the local people there and basically say, tend to your own knitting and prosper and do well and just pay your taxes to us and we'll leave you be, basically. We'll give you benefits and you reap benefits from us. Well, Habakkuk is looking at this bitter, hasty people, and they're the last gasp of this particular kind of brutality in the ancient world. Now, we don't know anything about the man Habakkuk, really. This doesn't even appear to be a Hebrew name. It seems to mean to hold or to embrace. Probably some scholars think that that name Habakkuk, meaning to embrace, would represent his lifting up or his holding Judah's condition up in the sight of God, so to speak, lifting it up to God. But he dates from the time of Josiah and Jehoahaz, and probably is writing during the reign of Jehoiakim, when Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah have just been taken away, along with a lot of other youth. And the key words in this little 3-chapter book, during this last gasp of the kings of Judah, there are 2 key words: justice. Habakkuk is showing us in his conversation with God, he's revealing from God's point of view justice against the kings of Judah, justice against this people who could not find it in their hearts to be faithful to God. And salvation is the other key word: justice and salvation. How long shall I cry out, Lord? How long shall I cry? Why? You see the frustration of a man of God trying to understand how this could be. Well, it's a matter of justice. And just like Jeremiah, just like Daniel, just like Ezekiel, this is agonizing for him to experience, to watch, to know about, to foresee what's coming on his own people. Even though God assures him that Babylon is going to be punished, idolatrous Babylon is going to be punished for their sins, it still challenges Habakkuk's faith, just like it did Jeremiah's and Ezekiel's. It challenges his faith to internalize the idea that God could use these vile, brutal, idolatrous Babylonians to punish Judah first, before he then turns and punishes them. One of the hardest lessons that these ancient Jews, that the kings of Kings and Chronicles and their people, one of the hardest lessons they had to digest was this idea that God could use people that they saw as worse than themselves to punish them. Habakkuk focuses on the Babylonians' military might. And God is telling him, don't focus on that power, that might. That's going to be taken away. They will become plunder for others to take because of their own sins. And we learn a lot from Habakkuk. You look down here at chapter 1, Habakkuk complains to God about this in verses 1 through 4. And so God's answer, talking about the destruction of Judah, look at verse 5. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. And here's what I'm going to do with them. I'm the children of Judah, the people of Judah, King Jehoiakim and King Zedekiah, and all these guys, they're seeing a mighty empire, the Assyrians, who have supplanted and conquered and deported their kinfolks Israel 100 years ago. They're seeing this world dominating empire taken over from the inside by the Babylonians, by a conquered people, and trying to understand how this could happen. And Habakkuk's message is, this is happening because it's God doing it. It's not that the Babylonians are so mighty and overwhelming and powerful. They're not. God's doing this. And God's doing this to use them to scourge you, to punish you. You wouldn't believe it if I told you, but here's what's going on. You come down in chapter 1 and you look at verses 12 and 13, and Habakkuk says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you've ordained them as judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad," and so forth. So Habakkuk, representative of his people, he's puzzling over this. How is it, God, that you can allow this to happen? And the Lord answers in chapter 2, "Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Because his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him. But the righteous or the just shall live by his faith." Now, Peter will quote that in 1 Peter chapter 1. Paul will reference that as well. The just shall live by faith. And throughout chapter 2, you have the rest of chapter 2, starting at verse 6, God's reassurance: I will deal with Chaldeans. I will deal with the Babylonians, and here's what I'll do. And chapter 2 is blunt about God dealing with them. At the end of chapter 2, he talks about, though, the idolatry of the Chaldeans in the context, the Babylonians. But there's a lesson and application for the idolatrous Jews as well. At verse 18 in chapter 2, "What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." So Habakkuk, in this conversation with God, is illustrating for us, and for the people of his own day, for that matter, the conundrum that they were struggling to wrap their heads around. How is it that God can be so focused on correcting, punishing us for sins, when there are other people that we see as worse, as more deserving than we are of punishment? Well, that brings us then over to the book of Ezekiel, and of course, or rather Daniel. I'm out of order here. Here we go. Daniel dates from 606 BC, the days of Josiah through Jehoiachin to Jehoiakim. And it's in the days of Jehoiakim as king when Nebuchadnezzar deposes Jehoiachin to put Jehoiakim on the throne. Pharaoh Necho had supplanted Jehoahaz with Jehoiachin, who reigned for 3 months. And then during that time, basically, the world is turned. Pharaoh has retreated to Egypt and his power has been broken. The Assyrians have been abruptly subsumed and overwhelmed by their own chattel people, the Babylonians, the wife to Assyria's husband. The wife has suddenly risen up and taken vengeance on the husband, as it were. And now the Babylonians are in charge, and they take Jehoiachin and depose him and put Jehoiakim on the throne. And Jehoiakim swears loyalty and fealty to Nebuchadnezzar, and of course then welshes on his promises and will ultimately be replaced by Zedekiah. But in the interim, Nebuchadnezzar kidnaps, I guess we could say, some of the children of the nobles and the royal families as a kind of insurance policy to try to ensure the king's and the nation's good behavior. Daniel, along with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are among those young men chosen to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's government and his court. Now, what we know about Daniel is that he was a member of the tribe of Judah. He's descended from one of the most prominent families in that tribe. You look at chapter 1 and verse 3 in Daniel, and it says there that it implies that he's actually a member of the royal family. And his name, Daniel, means that God is my judge. He comes to our attention because he's one of the young men taken away as a hostage or as a captive in 606. It quickly becomes obvious that he was very well versed in the scriptures, obviously been through Hebrew school and so forth. And in Babylon, he's going to be highly educated in secular studies as well. He and his companions are exposed to all the wisdom of the Babylonians and so forth, kind of like Moses was brought up in all the wisdom of the Egyptians in his day. Their purpose in bringing these young men is, number one, to try to ensure the good behavior of their families in submitting to the Babylonian authorities. But number two, they're going to be the vanguard of trying to Babylonianize the conquered peoples. And so they're exposed to the food and the religion and the customs and the education of the Babylonians. In one sense, they're trying to stamp out any vestiges of national identity or loyalty to their God. And in that, they're not successful, of course. But Daniel and his companions are going to rise to positions of high authority and positions of honor because God is with them. Daniel is going to live through the entire period of the captivity, just like I said a moment ago. He'll be God's spokesman in Babylon. He probably dies there somewhere in his 90s. And during that time, he's going to have served everybody from Nebuchadnezzar down through Cyrus in various high offices. At one point, he's going to be the head satrap or the number one bureaucrat in the whole government. One thing that's unusual about the book of Daniel is that there's not any defined call to serve as a prophet. But there's no doubt that he serves God in that way. And he's God's representative to Nebuchadnezzar, among other things. Now, the theme of Daniel is in chapter 4, verses 17 and 25 and 32 that we talked about a while ago. God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever he will. And the point that Daniel makes that Judah needs to grasp is that God is sovereign over individuals. God rules individuals, and God rules nations. Remember the common perception of most idolatrous peoples. Well, our God rules in our land, and your God rules in your land, and these different deities are tied to their territories. Daniel is emphasizing, for his own people's benefit and to the Babylonians, look, Israel's God rules everything, everybody, everywhere, all the time. He is the God. Now, that message does not convert the Babylonians wholesale. It doesn't even convert Nebuchadnezzar fully, though eventually he's going to, down here in chapter 4, he's going to be humiliated enough to acknowledge the power of Daniel's God. Now, chapter 1 gives us the background of everything here. Daniel was captured. He's taken from Jerusalem as a captive to Babylon, along with King Jehoiakim and others, because of their faithlessness, their rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. Keeping a conquered king alive as a hostage was seen as a gesture of the power of the conquering king, the generosity of the captor. Now, taking the vessels from Solomon's temple and putting them in a pagan temple, that supposedly demonstrates that the pagan deity is superior to Israel's God. What this really is an object lesson to the Israelites, to the people of God, to demonstrate that God was aware of how they had mistreated him, and that he is using these pagan people to punish them for their mistreatment. So, Daniel, during this time, grows to maturity in Babylon, enters into his career as a diplomat, statesman, governor, bureaucrat, whatever you want to call him, a royal counselor. You look at chapter 1 in verses 8 through 16, you see Daniel's determination to do what's right. Shows us that in spite of the corruption that was pretty much endemic in Judah, there were still pockets of people who were well trained in the faith of Israel. He stands out in this test that he proposes. You look at chapter 2, and now he's the king's counselor. He interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and he's elevated to a greater position and prospers. So in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, at verse 47, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges the God of Daniel as superior to all of the other gods. But that does not say that he becomes a worshiper of God. He's just very impressed with the ability of Daniel's God to do something that none of his other prophets could do, none of his other idolatrous prophets could do. You look down to chapter 3, and here's the presumptuousness of the king with Daniel's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, the business with the bow down to the idol, and if you don't, you get burned up in the furnace, and God delivers them from the burning fiery furnace, and so on. Daniel, as far as the people of his day are concerned, Daniel is a leader among the Jews. Daniel is a living illustration of what Jeremiah told his people. Pray for the city where God sends you. Pray for the welfare of the city. Settle down, buy a house, have a family, get married, have a family, have some grandkids. You're going to be there a while. Daniel is a living illustration of that being done. Now, he doesn't have a family and children, but he is prospering in the land where God has sent him. Now, as far as the people of his day are concerned, one of the focuses of Daniel's prophetic work starts in chapter 7. And from chapter 7 to the end of the book of Daniel, what we have are a series of visions of future events. And you look at Daniel chapters 8 and 9, and in context, what you have is, in a sense, a roadmap from the days of Daniel to the coming of the Messiah. And you see the rise and fall of kingdoms there. You see Ahasuerus depicted there in symbolic form. You see Alexander, the goat that rushes over the whole earth, and so forth. And the coming of the Romans, the interlude of the Maccabees, and so forth. All of these things in symbolic form. And what he's doing for those people in their captivity is laying out, in essence, the roadmap of restoration. But it's not merely restoration to the promised land. It's restoration to fellowship with God in Christ, the coming of the Messiah. And so in chapter 12, you have the time of the end that's described here, the time and times and a half time and so forth. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, verse 2, shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. The condition of the dead and the coming resurrection depicted here. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase, and so forth. And what Daniel, the time of the end, by the way, is not the end of the world, but the time of the end of their captivity, when they would have use for this roadmap, if you will, that leads them from captivity to a right relationship with God, ultimately through the Christ. So that then brings us to the last of our writing prophets during the period of the kings and the prophets, and that would be Ezekiel. So take your Bible and flip back to the book of Ezekiel. And here you've got 48 chapters, 2 sections, chapters 1 through 24. The message of Ezekiel is that Jerusalem and Judah absolutely must fall. That is, Jerusalem and Judah must be demolished, must be destroyed because of the sin of God's people. Now, Ezekiel, a contemporary of Jeremiah and Daniel and Habakkuk and Zephaniah that we talked about earlier, where Daniel is apparently from the royal house, and Jeremiah has some priestly lineage in Jerusalem. Ezekiel functions as a priest as well as a prophet. That would make him a Levite. And the focus of his ministry, his prophetic work, is among what we would describe as the common people. They're actually the middle class, upper middle class that have been exiled along the Kibar Canal. Middle class captives. Daniel is in the palace in Babylon, riches and opulence, surrounded by conniving and deceiving and backstabbing and all the things that go with highfalutin office. Jeremiah is in Jerusalem, seeing the poor man's version of all this machination and backstabbing and lying and so forth in the kingdom there. Ezekiel is among the more ordinary people. He deals with the elders of Israel who have been exiled in Babylon. He is a captive. Some biblical scholars identify the river Kibar as one of the large canals around Babylon that emptied into the Euphrates River, and so it may well be. But you've got two parts to the book of Ezekiel. Like I said, the first half, chapter 1 through chapter 24, Ezekiel is in Babylon dealing with the elders of the people and the people themselves, what we would call the middle class Jews. They're living there. They're basically free people. They're in business for themselves. They're farmers. They have vineyards. They ply their various trades. They have their shops and their businesses and so forth. And all they want to do is go home. They want to go back to Israel. And they're not allowed to. They are not slaves. They're captives in the sense of being exiles, not slaves. They're not in jail. They're not being bullied and pushed around, really. This is the time when the synagogue is beginning to come into existence, or soon will during the captivity, because once the temple is destroyed, there's no more morning and evening sacrifice, no more worship at the temple, no more high holy feast days at the temple. And so they've got to do something to preserve their heritage, to preserve their learning, their awareness of God. And this is where the existence of the synagogue begins, is in captivity. And so Ezekiel may very well be a part of that. We don't have any way of knowing that. But during this first half of the book of Ezekiel, which would correspond to the years of Zedekiah's reign from 597 to 586 and the destruction of Jerusalem, during this time period, Ezekiel is arguing basically with the elders of the people who are in captivity. And they're communicating back and forth with the folks in Jerusalem. The postal service was very efficient. You could write a letter. It would get from Babylon to Jerusalem in about 3 weeks' time. And so in 6 weeks, you could have an answer to questions. You could find out how Aunt Myrtle's doing or whatnot. And there was a lot of communication and cross-pollination between the people in that respect. And these elders, leaders in captivity, they're very aware of what Jeremiah is doing in Jerusalem and how unpopular he is and how they don't like his message any better in Babylon than they do in Jerusalem. And they like what they're hearing of Shemaiah and Hananiah and these guys that are saying, oh, it's not going to last long and it won't be bad. God will restore us and so forth. And Ezekiel is telling them it's not going to happen. It's not going to be that way. Chapter 1 through chapter 24, Ezekiel is telling them during Zedekiah's reign, here's what God's going to do. You keep saying the temple standing proves God is on our side. God's going to take away your temple. You've abused it. You've misused it. You've defiled it. You've made a mockery of it. God's going to take it away. You think it's your lucky charm that this prevents bad things from happening to you and lets you sin with impunity? God's going to take it away. And so from chapter 1 to chapter 24, the message that Ezekiel has for the captives who don't want to believe it any more than the people in Jerusalem want to believe Jeremiah is Jerusalem, the palace, the temple, all of Judah must fall. The temple's going to be destroyed. It has to be destroyed to get you to see what you need to see. And then in chapter 25, after Jerusalem has fallen and the temple has been destroyed and the people in captivity have heard how bad it is, and maybe at this point they're beginning to see some of their relatives who were still in Jerusalem beginning to trickle in to captivity, chains around their necks, wounded and filthy and ragged and starved from the siege of Jerusalem and so forth, treated like slaves, maybe even beginning to buy some of their kinfolks out of slavery. Chapters 25 through 48, Ezekiel spends the rest of his time trying to reassure the captives, his people, including these new captives, that God has not abandoned them. They're not in captivity because God has abandoned them. They're in captivity because they need to learn something, and that is God's in charge. God will keep his promise to restore them and bring them back to their land when their 70 years of punishment in exile are finished. Now, Ezekiel, as one of the writing prophets of the era of the Kings and Chronicles, is valuable to us because he provides us an example of the Bible commenting on itself. You get over to Revelation chapter 4, and Revelation chapter 4 actually explains Ezekiel chapter 1. That is, both contexts, Ezekiel 1 and Revelation 4, emphasize God rules over all of creation, and especially all of the different nations of humanity. Now, here in Ezekiel 1, the image of the Lord's glory is one of the most vivid in all of the scriptures. And you look at chapter 2, Ezekiel's commission as a prophet is the focus. It's the purpose of the vision that you see in chapter 1, the vision of the glory of the Lord. That gets Ezekiel's attention. And now God makes two basic points to Ezekiel. Number one, you speak regardless of whether the people accept what you say or not. Chapter 2 and verse 5, whether they hear or refuse to hear, they are a rebellious house. Whether they hear or refuse to hear, they will know that a prophet has been among them. So you speak whether they believe you, accept you or not. And then in verses 6 and 7, you don't worry about the consequences of delivering my message. Verses 6 and 7, you son of man, be not afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit on scorpions. Be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house, and you shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. So, God repeatedly warns Ezekiel, I'm sending you to talk to some stubborn, hard-hearted people. Well, that's how they got in this mess in the first place. That's how they got in this situation. From the kings on down, that's how they wound up here. You look at Ezekiel chapters 4 and 5, and you have some of the most vivid, graphic warning signs God ever sent his people about their impending destruction. You have the symbolizing of Jerusalem's siege. Take a brick, chapter 4, verse 1, lay it before you, or a clay tile, basically. Lay it out before you, engrave on it a city of Jerusalem. In other words, make a map, make a diorama, as it were. Put a siege works against it, build a siege wall against it, cast up a map. Make a visual illustration of what's going to happen, Ezekiel, so that everybody who sees it can recognize it. And then you get to chapter 5, go lie on one side, on your left side, in some public place, maybe with this tile right there beside you in sight, and do this for over a year, 390 days. And while you're doing that, you prophesy and you tell about Judah's punishment. And then when 390 days are over, flip sides and prophesy for another 40 days and talk about the destruction of Jerusalem during that time. And while you're doing that, you don't eat much. You get thin and emaciated looking. I want you to be a visual illustration of how the people in Jerusalem are going to look when they come into captivity. And then shave your head and shave your beard with a sword, and divide up the hair and dispose of it, burn part of it and chop up part of it and scatter part of it to the wind. This is an illustration of God's judgment against Jerusalem. They get over to chapter 12, and Ezekiel foretells in detail the capture and the exile of King Zedekiah that took place in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 through 7. And remember what happened to Zedekiah. He tried to run away. He was captured. He was brought to the Rabshakeh, and the last thing he sees are his sons being executed, and then his eyes are put out, so that last image of his sons dying in front of him is burned into his memory for the balance of his life. What makes Ezekiel's record significant is that these events, this description in chapter 12, is recorded 5 years before it happened. Had Zedekiah paid attention to the news coming out of Babylon, he'd have known what was going to happen to him, because Ezekiel foretold it. Well, flip over to chapter 18. And here in Ezekiel chapter 18, you have what may be the most direct statements in the entire Bible on the subject of individual personal responsibility. These people, the Jews that are in captivity, even before they were in captivity, they were already whining and complaining that their misfortunes and their suffering was not their fault, it's our ancestors' fault. The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. It's not us, it's our ancestors that did this. They're probably thinking about Manasseh and his child sacrifice, and Athaliah murdering the sons of the royal house to try to take over the kingdom and so forth. And God's response is, as sure as I live, this proverb shall no more be used by you in Israel. In other words, I'm going to make sure that you feel the weight of your own sins and you quit trying to lay this off on your parents. Behold, all souls are mine, verse 4. The soul of the Father, as well as the soul of the Son, is mine. The soul who sins shall die. So Ezekiel, speaking for God, says, I'm not taking any of this "it's not our fault" nonsense. You get punished for what you do. Well, think about what Paul writes in Romans chapter 14, verses 10 and 12, or in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse, I got to look it up. I don't remember. It's 1st or 2 Corinthians, chapter 5 and verse 21, where he says, we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. We're each personally, individually responsible for ourselves. That would be 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I think I said 1 Corinthians a minute ago, but 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we stand before the judgment seat of Christ. So Ezekiel is emphasizing here that these folks have to bear the responsibility for their own actions and their own sins. And this is something they're already in captivity. They're already experiencing. And remember, the people Ezekiel is dealing with are not experiencing the hardship of captivity the same way that their family, their kinfolks, their brethren over in Jerusalem and Judah are about to. They're actually living relatively free, relatively prosperous, relatively comfortable lives as exiles in Babylon. But they don't want to accept that they have been responsible for what is happening, that they have a share in the responsibility for what's happening and what's about to happen to Jerusalem and to Judah. In chapter 25 of Ezekiel, 25 through 32, God presents a series of declarations of impending judgment against different heathen nations that are neighbors to his people. And he talks about the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites and the Philistines and the Phoenicians, or the people of Tyre and Sidon, and the Egyptians. And the main lessons, the main applications that we ought to draw out of this are, first of all, that God judges them. God declares his judgment against these pagan people, these idolatrous nations. And the fact that he does shows that even though they don't worship him, even though they don't even acknowledge him or his authority as God, he still holds them accountable. He still holds them under his authority, under his law. There's no way for us to opt out of responsibility before God. A lot of folks try to avoid being accountable to God. Well, I don't acknowledge him. I don't acknowledge his authority, so he doesn't have anything to say to me. Yes, he does. Whether you acknowledge him or not, you're responsible to him, because he made you. He made heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11. And every one of us shall give account of himself unto God. Romans chapter 14. But the second point that comes out of these judgments against these nations is in chapter 28 and verse 15. And it's addressed to the king of Tyre, that is the coastal city over near Phoenicia. And here, Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, verse 11. Say to him, thus says the Lord God, you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, in the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle. Crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. This is a metaphorical description of him. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. An image here of all the good that God had done. Notice verse 15. You were blameless in all your ways from the day that you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. Now that takes us back to chapter 18, verses 4 and 20, about personal responsibility. That takes us forward to Luke chapter 18, verse 16, and Jesus' words about little children being innocent of sin. The soul that sins, it shall die. Father shall not bear the iniquity of the Son, neither shall the Son bear the iniquity of the Father. Each bears his own. Calvin notwithstanding, you were not created sinful. You were not born a little rattlesnake sinner. You were innocent, just like the king of Tyre, until sin, unrighteousness, was found in you. Now, flip over to chapter 33, where we're done with the prophecies against the foreign nations for the time being. And in chapter 33, we're familiar with chapter 3, chapter 33, Son of man, I've made you a watchman to the house of Israel, a sentry on the wall, warn them, etc., etc. But notice in chapter 3, verse 11, say to them, this is Ezekiel speaking for God to the elders and the people of Israel, of Judah, in captivity, in relatively prosperous captivity. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn back from your evil ways. For why will you die? Why do you choose to die, O house of Israel? God does not enjoy seeing any person suffer. In the context here, why will you die? The death of the wicked. This is a reflection on what has happened to Jerusalem. Jerusalem has fallen. The people of Judah are captives. These captives are seeing their kinfolks emaciated, starved, filthy, sick, ragged, coming into slavery because of their stubborn resistance in the days of Zedekiah. Why will you die? I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked. It didn't give God pleasure to see Jerusalem destroyed. It did not give God pleasure to raise up the Babylonians for this purpose. God would have been much better pleased had his people been faithful, and this never had to take place. So there's no schadenfreude on God's part. There's no enjoying their suffering. God is not just gleefully rubbing his hands together. Oh boy, they're really going to get it now and suffer. That's not God. That's Cotton Mather's image of God, that colonial era preacher in New England who was responsible for the sermon "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," where he depicts God like some kind of fiend, almost dangling man above the fires of hell and delighting in man's screams. That's not the God of the Bible. That's not the God that Ezekiel presents to us here. God does not enjoy seeing anybody suffer, but he will allow suffering to try to refine us and bring us back to him. And so in chapter 37, then, as the people are now in captivity, Zedekiah has been captured, seen his sons die, and been blinded and brought into captivity along with the people from Jerusalem. We're now at probably the year 585 BC. The temple is in ruins. The walls have been demolished around the remnants of the city of Israel. The people, the captives, the folks that Ezekiel has been dealing with all along are questioning, well, maybe our God was just a figment of our imagination all along. If this could happen, why didn't he save us? Why didn't he preserve us? Come to chapter 37, and we have Ezekiel's awesome vision of God restoring the health of his people. And the whole point of the vision is for Ezekiel to pass this on to the people as a story, a vision, an image that they can cling to remember that they are going to go home. They are going to be restored. God is going to keep his promise. God is going to restore the health of his people after the dryness and the suffering of Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel sees God reclothing dried out bones with flesh and sinew and breathing new life into those bodies in verses 1 through 14. And verse 14 in chapter 37 is the key to understanding the whole vision. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord. Now, our friends over in the Mormon cult jump over here at verse 15, and they try to take these two sticks that are mentioned in verses 15 through 23 and try to say that's the Bible in the Book of Mormon. And without going into a lot of detail, their reasoning is completely specious from A to Z in that. The two sticks, one is labeled Judah, the other is labeled Israel. The context shows us that they represent the reunion of northern and southern kingdoms, the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, that takes place not in the release of Cyrus in 536. Cyrus's decree says Judah and any one of the tribes that want to can go home. But that's not what this is anticipating. What this anticipates is the reunion in Christ. Now, the final section of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48, give us a vision of the temple of the Lord and of worship in it. And if you look carefully and look at the dimensions and descriptions that are given here, the thing that stands out is that the picture that Ezekiel portrays for us, the dimensions and the descriptions, they don't fit Solomon's temple, which had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They don't fit Zerubbabel's temple that will be built when the captivity is over. And they don't fit the much, much larger temple that Herod had caused to be enlarged and remodeled in Jesus' day. And the reason that they don't fit either the dimensions or the practices that are described is that Ezekiel's vision looks beyond the national restoration of Judah. Ezekiel is not forecasting here merely coming out of Babylonian captivity back into the land of promise. That's going to take place, and Daniel gave the roadmap to that. And Jeremiah promised that. And even Habakkuk referenced that. What Ezekiel is depicting here is Judah's spiritual, Israel's spiritual restoration to God that takes place in Christ. The idea in the 21st century, 20th and 21st centuries, that Old Testament Judaism remains a viable alternative to Christianity for Jews has no basis in Scripture. When Paul writes to the Romans and talks about Jews becoming Christians and says, "So shall all Israel be saved." So is an adverb of manner. He's not saying Israel is going to be saved apart from Christ. He's saying in exactly the same way that the Gentiles are saved, all Israel will be saved in Christ. And so the temple that Ezekiel sees here doesn't represent any earthly structure at all. If it did, we'd be entirely within our rights to ask, well, why didn't Zerubbabel build this temple? Because Zerubbabel had this information. But what Zerubbabel built was a poor man's copy of Solomon's temple. This doesn't represent any earthly structure. It's a metaphoric description. It's an image of the temple that Jesus promised to rebuild. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it up again, John chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. And what Jesus was talking about was his body, yes, his physical body, but ultimately his spiritual body, the church. That brings us to the end of the writing prophets that correspond to the time of the kings. And it's interesting to note how much future history those writing prophets presented to their own people in their own day, and how they pleaded and cajoled and tried to reason with them to return to the Lord. And yet over and over and over and over, they refused. It makes you think of Jesus' words to Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that killeth the prophets and stoneth them that are sent unto thee. How often I would have gathered you under my wings as a hen gathereth her chicks. Jesus speaking for God the Father there. All of Old Testament history. How often I tried, and you would not. The burden, the responsibility rested entirely on them because of their sins. Let me stop here. Questions, comments, observations. Next week, we'll do a rapid overview of everything that we've covered in anticipation of the final. And the final will be much like the midterm, just about 150 million questions. Questions?
Thank you, David.
Oh, well, my pleasure, Jim.
And you all have a safe trip home.
We propose to do exactly that. Lord willing, we'll be home Saturday evening.
Thank you for the class.
Thank you, Eddie. I appreciate you being here, brother. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes.
All right. Take care, everybody. We'll call it class.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.